Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to today's event with Lenny Cassuto and Richard Weisbuch discussing their book, The New PhD, How to Build a Better Graduate Education, in conversation with James Van Wyck. Today's event is part of Harvard Bookstore's Friday Forum series, which takes place on Friday afternoons during the academic year as a way to highlight scholarly books in a wide range of fields. Though we remain digital for the time being, we have a full schedule of virtual events in the coming weeks as part of this afternoon series and others, so do check out our website for our complete event calendar. For today's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you'd like to ask the speakers something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows, and do feel free to submit questions at any point throughout the presentation. If you go to the chat function of this presentation, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your copy of The New PhD. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to this series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you're able to extend to us at this time. And lastly, as you may know, if you've participated in large virtual gatherings lately, which I assume you have, technical issues might come up. We do apologize in advance for that. If any technical glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Lenny Cassuto is a professor of English at Fordham University and a monthly columnist on graduate education at the Chronicle of Higher Education. He is the author or editor of 9 books, covering everything from American crime fiction to the racial grotesque in literature, as well as a previous work on the chaotic world of higher education, appropriately titled The Graduate School Mess. Robert Weisbuch is founder and head of Robert Weisbuch and Associates, a consultancy for liberal arts education in colleges and universities. Previously, he was president of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation and of Drew University, where he served as the college's 11th president from 2005 to 2012. James Van Wyck is an assistant dean for professional development in the office of the dean of the graduate school at Princeton University. He is co-editor of and contributor to the forthcoming book, The Reimagined PhD, Navigating 21st Century Humanities Education. He's published numerous articles and essays in many venues, including the New England Quarterly, the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Ed, and elsewhere. Today, they will be discussing Lenny and Robert's co-authored book, The New PhD, How to Build a Better Graduate Education, a dynamic and urgent call for reform within American academia that Earl Lewis, founding director of the Center for Social Solutions, calls, quote, a must-read, one to be argued with, embraced, refined, but not ignored. Seeking to forward that impossible bridge to nowhere that so many PhDs encounter as part and parcel of the academic job search, the new PhD proposes a more humane and socially dynamic approach to the future of academia. For so long, burgeoning academics have been hindered by lack of employment. But what if the PhD was structured less as a highly contingent path to the ivory cloister and more as a tool for public service, one that is rich in resources, varying futures, and public scholarship? As we continue to navigate the ever-changing and ever-stormy landscape of this ongoing pandemic, the new PhD is sure to be a necessary guide for anyone looking to pursue advanced education and who are asking themselves that essential question, what comes next? We are so excited to be hosting this event today, and without further ado, I will now turn things over to Lenny, Robert, and James.
And here we are, and here you all are. We're very happy to be here, and thanks for joining us today. We're going to kick things off with a question for Bob and Lenny from myself. I just want to encourage you all to use that Q&A function. You needn't wait till the end of our conversation to chime in. In good times, we would have interacted with you all as we walked into the store. So please feel free to interact with us in the Q&A as we're engaging each other as panelists up front. So this one, maybe for you, Lenny, first, and then for you, Bob, is why should we, academics and non-academics alike, care about the future of the PhD?
Thanks, James. Welcome, everybody. We've needed to care about this for a long time. And the simplest way to put it is that the PhD education socializes students as well as educates them and it socializes and educates them to want one outcome above all others, to feel that that if they don't achieve that one outcome, they will be failures. And as a result, if you teach somebody to want something that you can't supply, the simplest way to put it is that you're teaching that person to be unhappy. And that is practically the worst thing that a teacher can do. It brings with it a sense of urgency. If we are teaching our students to be unhappy, and I think that the results amply show that we do this unfortunately too well, then we have to rise and change our ways.
You know, I think I would add to that simply a statement made by a graduate student, a graduate of the University of Chicago, who said that she felt that she'd been a victim of a Ponzi scheme. But there's another aspect of this, and it's the other aspect of this that almost led us to have the subtitle, Why PhD Education Matters to Everyone. The students we work with on the PhD become not simply those who stay in teaching are teachers of teachers and teachers of teachers of teachers and so on. So that the norms that we create in doctoral education tend to filter down to all the way down to first grade and up from there. So this is where the norms get set in academia. Beyond that, so many PhDs, and we hope more PhDs and more knowingly, enter every social sector and can provide creative leadership in any number of ways. And so if we don't encourage these students to think creatively about how their learning can add to the society in any number of ways, we're not just wasting their lives, we're wasting their capacities, and the society itself suffers.
Yeah, that's well put, and both of you kind of touched on already that this is an incredibly fraught moment for graduate students. The PhD is crucible enough, but to do a PhD in this moment is incredibly challenging. Maybe I'll flip the question and ask it again in a slightly different way. What's lost or what could be gained if the PhD was leveraged in these new ways? Some of the ways you've outlined in the book, some of the ways we're going to talk about today, but what can be gained beyond academia when PhDs are placed or find careers or have outcomes beyond the tenure track? Let's go in the same order for this one, Lenny and then Bob.
Yeah, so in addition to what we said, so there's an obvious flip to this, that if we teach our students to not only prepare them for, but to honor the kinds of outcomes that they already face, they will be happier. But there is another aspect to this, which is that that PhDs, when they leave the academy and go out into the world, become ambassadors for higher education, particularly if they're working productively and enjoying themselves, and bringing pleasure and energy to their work. Higher education, I think that that everyone in this audience is familiar with the idea that higher education has been taking quite a beating, not just in the last 10 years, not even just in the last 20. We are caricatured beyond recognition. We're criticized, not always based on facts, for the behaviors that we allegedly engage in, the over specialization and so forth. The question of cost is also becoming a major issue in conjunction with these things. That when PhDs go out into the world, they're the best advertisement for higher education that we can give. That these are specialists, wonderfully talented people who are working in all different kinds of ways to applying their expertise. That alone is something that helps to counter the caricatures that higher education is receiving in the marketplace of ideas and in the world.
Yeah, and I'm going to interject briefly before I go to Bob with the same question, because I want us to start thinking about expanding on the phrase wonderfully talented and getting to also some more granular things that kind of emerge in the process of the PhD. What is it that the PhD grants that perhaps the MBA does not, and so forth? But so Lenny, I'll come back to you on that. But Bob, what's the positive outcome of the PhD living in the world beyond academia? In other words, if we solve this problem of the PhD, what benefits would come of this for, let's say a citizen who does not have a vested interest in higher education itself, but maybe wants to think more about the climate or other issues? What does the PhD bring in these venues that perhaps someone without a PhD does not?
Well, let me throw back a question at you. What is education for? The founders of our nation were very clear about this. Education is for the public good. Education is for social engagement. If you think about the private colleges and universities, they were begun by religious denominations, primarily to educate ministers, but also to raise the ethical level of a nation, of a society. Public universities began also with the notion that education refers primarily to the public good, not simply to an individual getting ahead. We've lost a sense of that in both undergraduate and graduate education. Now, at all times, when democracy itself has been recently threatened, we need to re-embrace the notion of education for the public good. Our book really has three emphases: student-centered, socially engaged or for the public good, and career diverse. So when you say, what do we have to gain? Let me suggest three things. For students, every program in this country, every PhD program worth its salt, if it embraces the notion that it's responsible for student outcomes, we can have a year of full employment of PhDs every single year in every program. So it benefits the students. It also, secondly, benefits the faculty. Who wants to be engaged in a process where perhaps 50 to 80% of our students don't get to where they want to go? Our goal is too narrow, and therefore our failure rate is far too great. But most of all, it is, as Lenny suggests, it's the society that benefits. It's every single sector of society. When I was working at the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, we had a panel discussion, and on that panel was a CEO of a major company, the head of Geico, Lou Simpson. And people were talking about, well, what can a PhD in, at the time we were talking about the humanities, what can a PhD in the humanities do? And Simpson said, wait a minute, that's the wrong question. The real question is, what can't they do? That is to say, it would take me years and years to teach a particular MBA how to think, how to do research, how to teach other people. Whereas your PhDs, with their rich sense of learning, their capacity to discover, their ability to bring a major research topic to term, their excellence as teachers, I can teach them a particular job within days. And so he said, why wouldn't I rather hire a PhD rather than an MBA? And then he paused for a minute. And he said, the reason is because your people don't apply.
Yeah, and that goes, I think, back to Lenny's comment about having your affections changed to want one thing and then not achieving that one thing and being, counting yourself to be a failure if you don't get that tenure track job. So,
and by the way, James, I mean, this is not an either or. That is to say, we care about academic positions. We're worried about the adjunctification of the faculty, of course. But the truth is that if you feel there's only one thing you can do, you're sort of making yourself into a victim. And a closed economy is a bad economy. If universities feel that PhD graduates can do any number of things and that the university must compete to keep them in the academy, we have a very different situation from the one we're suffering now.
Well, that's really well said. I love this idea you mentioned within, and I kind of prompted Lenny, and he's probably been scribbling down some notes to think about, like, what are the skills that PhDs acquire in the particular process of going through the PhD, which is different from other degrees. For those of you who are attending, who are less familiar with the PhD, in Bob's phrase, capacity to discover, is buried the idea that PhDs produce new knowledge. It's one of the requirements for receiving a PhD, that you don't just synthesize or rediscover, but you actually leave something, you bring something into the world that had you not completed the PhD wouldn't exist. And so one of the other phrases that I really love, besides capacity to discover, is also, you kind of touched on it, but that the ability to tolerate ambiguity and also just to be very nimble in thinking. I don't know necessarily that those are the skills that people associate with PhDs, right? Because you, myself, and Lenny, others in the audience, we're around PhDs all the time. But of course, about 1% roughly of the population has a PhD. And so many people, just as they don't encounter farmers or enlisted people in the military, don't often encounter a PhD. So maybe as we go through this, I'm also thinking about, you were both recently on NPR and Michelle Martin asked you, well, what is a PhD? It was a striking question to me. And I think you both handled it really well, but it is an interesting thing to think about, a fundamental question before we talk about leveraging it and creating diverse pathways for PhDs. Maybe we get to the idea of what is a PhD for in the new PhD that you are both, outlining in your book.
I can put this, what is the PhD, but the advanced version of the question. That I was talking to somebody in Ireland the other day who works with PhDs to help prepare them for diverse careers. There are a lot of the same problems on the other side of the Atlantic than we have here. And she said, PhDs have so many tools, but they don't know that they have them. And that's one of the biggest problems to start with, that if you are educated to believe that you are such a specialist, that you're a Lamborghini, then it can change your view of the world to learn that you are an all-terrain vehicle. And PhDs really are all-terrain vehicles. They are, what is a PhD? A PhD is an information specialist. PhDs can work with information with greater skill and facility than most other members of the public by virtue of their education. PhDs can analyze, synthesize, distill, and perhaps most of all, teach. All those skills come in the course of doctoral education. And what you apply them to, they can obviously be applied within academia. And I will stress again, we're not against academic job outcomes. We want them as much as you do, but we want PhDs and the teachers of PhDs to understand that, but for a brief moment in the history of higher education, PhDs have always prepared for multiple outcomes. That one brief moment in the post-war era in the 1960s was a watershed, but it was the anomaly. It wasn't the norm. And it well behooves us to go back to the future and understand that PhDs are educated to serve society, and society greatly benefits when they get out there and do it.
One way of responding to your question, James, as well as what Lenny just said, and I think this underlines what Lenny just said. This is an email that I received after our NPR interview from a former colleague of mine at the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Richard Bennett. Richard had gotten his PhD in Comp Lit from Princeton, and I had hired him as a program officer, but I needed a development director. And after about 3 months, I finally convinced him that it was not a terrible thing to raise money. And Richard became a superb director of development for us, worked for Princeton, ended up running major gifts for the World Wildlife Foundation, and has had just a terrific career. In fact, he is now at Harvard doing major gifts for the business school. And in response to our NPR interview, he wrote this to me. Working in academia, I've always derived some credibility simply for having the credential of a PhD, and donors also give you more respect for it. I also still enjoy keeping in touch with Princeton, where I serve on the Comp Lit Department Advisory Council. But something that is of growing significance to me, I think, as I get older, is really the intangible but enormous value of having the confidence to read and learn and not be overawed by new complexities.
Mm.
Developing a facility for and confidence in writing and speaking is a huge, not to be taken for granted advantage in non-academic settings.
Mm.
And you get testimonials like that from so many PhDs who leave academia. One more thing I would just like to add, if I could. Several years ago, Berkeley conducted a study called 10 Years After, and they quizzed PhD graduates in 5 different fields. In the arts and sciences, I believe one field was physics, I think, and another was English. And the question came up, are you glad that you got a PhD? And those who had left the PhD answered overwhelmingly, like over 90%, yes. I should also mention that the people that they surveyed who had left academia showed a slightly higher percentage of career happiness and fulfillment than those who remained in academia.
Yeah, it's interesting that one of the threads that we're seeing throughout so far is happiness, satisfaction, because of course, you know, Bob, you've led an organization, you know how crucial it is to have people who feel that they're in the right role, doing work that they're compelled to do, that they're interested and invested in. Really striking to me that we should focus more on that when we think about PhD training. I want to go back to the future, as Lenny said, talk a little bit about history. Most of what we're discussing here has some of the practices of higher education have their roots in the medieval period. We wear funny robes when we get our PhD. We do hooding ceremonies. We do things that harken back to long ago times. But some of the history of the PhD is a fairly recent vintage. Lenny, maybe you could start and just take us through a quick, how did we get here history of the PhD?
Well, I'm going to be super quick. I'm going to focus on one keyword here. That keyword is credential. That the difference between the history of higher education in the United States and the history of higher education in Europe, which inspired it, is that in the United States, particularly from the post-Civil War era onward, the emphasis has been on credentials. In the last 25 or 30 years, Europe has increasingly moved to emulate the United States in this way. But it was originally how the United States differentiated itself from Europe. That in the United States, universities came at about the same time that the middle class was distinguishing itself as an identity. You know, there's always been a middle class, that when you have a class structure, you look at what's in the middle, that's the middle class. But if you ask Americans, most Americans, if they're asked to identify themselves, will say that they're middle class, that it's a label. The label evolved after the Civil War, and as it came into being, it was the same time that universities came into being, and the alert university presidents of that period understood that one of the ways that they could take advantage of this emerging professional identity was to create credentials that would consecrate it. So the American Research University was credentials based just about from the beginning, and it has remained so. And if we look at the history of American higher education since, we can never separate the use value of the credential from the value, transcendent or otherwise, of the knowledge that's being imparted. So the practical value, the emphasis on use is coiled into the DNA of American higher education, and we ignore the emphasis on use at our own peril, and we ignore it all too often, I think.
Yeah, there's a reason Americans know about Edison and not, somebody who got the Nobel Prize last year, right? We know our inventors, but not our theoretical thinkers. So yeah, that's really well said. We've got some questions coming in the Q&A. We'll pivot to them in a couple minutes. I wonder if either of you, maybe I'll give this one to Bob quickly, and then we can pivot it. Lenny, if you want to answer this one, if not, fine. We can move to the Q&A. But it strikes me that what you've described so far almost implies a binary between academic and non-academic. And we know, and you both know this better than I do, that there are other fields like engineering, like computer science, in which people are poached by Google and then lured back by Harvard. And there's a much more fluid relationship between, let's say, an industry sector and an academic department. In the new PhD, is that something you envision, a more fluid boundary between these for humanists and social sciences PhDs? Maybe just talk a little bit about the so-called academic and non-academic distinction.
I think the answer to your question is an absolute yes. That is to say, let me give a very concrete example. One of the kinds of careers that people who love the university might contemplate is working at a university, but not necessarily as a full-time professor. Perhaps you'll teach on the side while you're working in the admissions office or in student services or in development or wherever. You can remain in an academic setting if you like, and perhaps do some occasional teaching and keep that aspect of your life going, while meanwhile you have a leadership position in the university in a different way. But more largely, yes, that is to say, scientists are used to moving in and out, and we talk about the phrase tech transfer. We need to do the same in the humanities and social sciences. Tech transfer in the humanities and social sciences gets us to the issue that I notice is on the Q&A, which is public scholarship. So we can take that up soon. But the point is absolutely, and let me say one other thing. I worked for Jim Grossman at the American Historical Association a few years ago when they began their career diversity initiative. And we went back to look at what I had been doing at Woodrow Wilson 20 years earlier, where we gave summer fellowships to students, PhD students, who found interesting work outside of academia for a summer. So you had one student who at the University of Virginia in African-American studies who started a freedom school for 12-year-olds in Mississippi. You had another student who wrote biographies for NASA, and so on and so forth. You had a student working for the Anti-Defamation League who was a comp lit graduate graduate student at Columbia. We asked the people who had been graduated from history whether that experience had been of use to them and where were they now. Interestingly, most of the people who got those fellowships, those summer fellowships, landed professorships ultimately. But to a person, and we're talking about 20 or 30 people that we found, said, but that summer that I spent outside of academia was maybe the most important part of my graduate education towards succeeding within academia. I learned how to get things done on time. I learned how to use my knowledge experientially. I was able to bring it all back into academia. So it's a two-way. And what we learn academically, again, we can translate into the experiential outside of the academy.
Yeah, that's really well said, Bob. Thanks for that. So I think we're at 12:32. I think I want to pivot to some of these questions that are coming in, and please keep them coming. These are great so far. So first, I don't know about the two of you, but I've been dogged by this attendee. Anonymous attendee asks, is there anything that current or prospective students can do to implement for themselves some of the restructuring you are suggesting in this book? Or is this more about colleges and universities needing to restructure the aim and curricula as a whole? Lenny, you want to go first?
Thank you, anonymous attendee, for the good question. The two questions. The answers are yes and yes.
Yeah.
And in the first case, what should a student do for himself or herself? And here I will start with something that I've said many times to graduate student audiences. Each graduate student in this audience, and you're invisible to us, by the way, but each graduate student in this audience, you're the CEO of your own graduate education. You're in charge of it. Your teachers are there to help you. The rest of the university, which is considerable in its capacity, is there to help you too. but you're the one who can and should make the decisions, because those decisions are the decisions you're going to have to live out in your lives. I've had graduate students ask me questions that they should be answering for themselves, because if I answer them, I'm not the one who has to live the consequences. And so as graduate students, you should be prepared to take it in hand, decide what it is that you want to do. And how do you do this? Well, I need to be necessarily vague here, because what an engineer is going to aim for is quite a bit different from what an art historian may aim for. But in both cases, reverse engineering is the principle that you need to adhere to. Start with either an outcome or a set of outcomes that you may want to prepare for. And then ask yourself, how can I get from here to there? What are the things that I need to do? What sorts of attributes, credentials, skills, background do I need to acquire in order to make myself most competitive to do that? Second half of the question, what should institutions do? Institutions should absolutely be making it easiest for students to engage in the process that I just described. Instead of pushing our students towards outcomes that we decide that that we either assume they want or decide that they should want, we should be consulting with our students constantly about, and individually, about what it is that they are seeking, and then organize our graduate education to make that happen. And how does it become more skills-based in this way? Well, not at the expense of disciplinary expertise necessarily. It's a matter of integrating a skill. For example, and I'll stop after this. In the humanities, collaboration is historically not something that has been baked into the curriculum. Humanists work alone, like piano players, but it's amply possible, and I think the advent of digital technology has demonstrated humanists can and do collaborate. This book that we're out here talking about today is a collaboration between two humanists. So humanists can collaborate. If you're teaching a graduate seminar, you can assign exercises that you might have once assigned to individual students, assign them to teams. That way students gain collaborative experience that they can generalize from. That's a way that you can bring a skill that helps outside of academia as well as inside it into the instructional orbit without diluting the rest of it.
Yes, students individually can take this in hand. And there is an online site called Imagine PhD, which helps you to think about possibilities for how you can use your learning beyond academia. But it's also the case that it shouldn't be that hard, that the institutions themselves should take some responsibility for being more creative and thinking about what you can do with your abilities, with your learning. And the fact is, as Len has just suggested, we can do this in individual courses. For instance, we have if you assign a paper, it would be very easy then to say, and now having written this paper using the language of our discipline, give us a couple of paragraphs that you might mention to your family members about why it's important and what you have to say in lingua franca. That's, by the way, something that's being done at various universities in terms of dissertations. North Dakota State has a process where students do a 5-minute video for a general audience, and there's even a contest for the best video each year. Stanford has the I Write program, where at the beginning of your dissertation, you attempt to write a 2-pager that explains what you're about to do, again, to non-experts. And there are non-experts, undergraduates and faculty, who read that rough copy, that rough draft, and usually it takes several drafts before someone learns how to relate to a more general audience. But more structurally, yes, there need to be new relationships between programs and career offices. Many of them have started to build up at the graduate level. We need much more of that than exists at present. Also need to relate to the alumni office so that there can be internships. Need to be the possibility in programs, perhaps, of not being a TA one semester, but doing an internship outside of the university. But most of all, Structurally, graduate deans need to be empowered with authority and funds that can be used as an incentive to put students first in every program. The graduate deanship is a very nebulous kind of deanship at present at most institutions. Sometimes it doesn't even exist. It's something done with the left hand by the vice president for research. That's really a disaster. That person doesn't have time. Your faculty deans don't have time. Someone needs to be the voice of the student, looking at the entire process from the knowledgeable position of understanding what's going on with the PhD nationally, but also serving as the student advocate. That's what the graduate dean needs to do, and the graduate dean needs influence and funds to make that happen program by program.
Thank you both for that. So Sarah, I think we've answered your what and how question, or at least touched on it. If you have a follow-up on that vein, please share it in the Q&A. I'm going to go back to our old friend Anonymous and ask the tail end of the third question on our screen. It says, do you have any suggestions or recommendations for talking between the PhD student and their advisor? That relationship, and I should disclose that Lenny was my dissertation advisor. That relationship can often be fraught because so much of what happens in graduate school happens because of that relationship. Give some advice to Anonymous about, they mention here jealousy and backstabbing workplaces that can affect a PhD's performance and may cause them to drop out of PhD programs. How do you counsel PhD students and or advisors when they're navigating that fraught relationship?
Well, we're all participants in a culture. It's academic culture, the relationship between advisors and advisees. And I want to come at this question backwards because there's a lot that we have to say about advising in the book, and there's a lot that needs to be done about advising. The anonymous attendee's question understandably talks about the advisor and the student, because that's how we have come to understand it, as a dyad that is theoretically unbreakable, and most important, takes place in some kind of privacy. That once you pick your advisor, your advisor whisks you out of public sight, and you are working in that advisor's lab or under that advisor's direction, and suddenly it's not the business of anybody else in the department. Well, we object to just about everything about that model because it limits the capacities of the student and the advisor together. Departments are repositories, universities are repositories of knowledge, advice, and specialization. And we need to open the advisor-student relationship outward so that the student in particular can benefit from all the different kinds of expertise that are out there. So let's examine the assumptions behind that advisor-advisee relationship and see if we can do something about it. Now, if you're a student, your options are fewer, obviously. You are the less powerful partner in the transaction. But there are things you can do. If you're a student, you have committee members and you have fellow students. And what it is that you can do in order to ventilate the relationship between the single advisor and the single student, to use the terms of one of our admired guides, Thomas Bender, in this area. What is one of the ways you can ventilate it may have to do with whether you're a scientist or a humanist, what department you're in, what that department's culture is like. It starts to get pretty granular. But we want to encourage you to examine your assumptions and see whether you can overturn them. And this is true whether you are a student, a faculty member, or an administrator. Cultures are hard to change, but they are least hard to change if attitudes change first.
Bob, if you want to follow up on that, otherwise I'm going to pivot. Okay.
There's actually a question on the chat that I'd like to respond to, if that's okay.
Sure. Let me just pivot one direction and then I'll come back. Is that okay?
Sure.
I was just going to say, in the chat, I've posted a link. Lenny mentioned before, you are the CEO of your own graduate education. One of the best lines from the graduate school mess, in my opinion, and it really helps orient graduate students as they think about navigating the experience. If you're a CEO, you need a board of advisors. You cultivate that board as the CEO. You bring in those people. And the mentorship map from the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity shows you that if you're going to break up the dyad, you need to be intentional about doing it. As the CEO, you need to cultivate mentors. Bob is a wonderful mentor of mine, and you're in charge of that process. No one is going to come up to you and say, "I want to be your mentor." You have to instigate in many ways a lot of the conversations that will lead to the dyad being broken up. So, Bob, I'm sorry for butting in on my mentor, but which question do you want to take from the chat?
Well, the one that I was going to take from the chat is, well, there were two, but I'll choose one. And that is, could we explain more about what we mean by public scholarship, which is a really good question. You know, public scholarship is, we mean a lot by it. That is to say, when a scholar writes for, let's say, the Times, the New Yorker, the Washington Post, or appears on PBS or whatever, you have an expert speaking to a non-expert audience. That's public scholarship. The kind of work that I mentioned earlier about asking students to explain their dissertation in a way that their mom and dad might understand, that's public scholarship, okay? That's one kind of public scholarship, and it occurs in any number of ways. By the way, the widest notion of public scholarship is every time that a faculty member walks into a classroom, because again, it's someone with expert knowledge working with people who don't have that degree of knowledge yet and trying to explain complexities without dumbing them down, but in a way that someone who isn't necessarily totally into the technicalities of the discipline is going to be not only interested by, but inspired by in order to make their own discoveries. But public scholarship also means civic engagement. And there, the question of who's the expert is wonderful, because if you engage, if you think about applying your learning to various social challenges in your community or in your region, yes, you are bringing your academic learning into a situation and hoping that it will benefit that situation, but you're also learning from those people on the ground who have experiential knowledge that you don't have, and you're going to be able to bring that back into your academic setting. So those are two different kinds of public scholarship. The second kind we see all the time in undergraduate education. It's a trend towards civic engagement in undergraduate education. We don't see it very much in PhD education, and yet think of how much more useful, in fact, PhD students can be in meeting social challenges given their larger degree of understanding and knowledge, and just being older, frankly, and also having learned how to be a teacher. You know, so again, this is one of those issues where we see possibilities where there currently is sort of a waste of human resources, where we see PhDs able to benefit their society more and more. Our whole message is not about having the tail wag the dog. It's about letting the dog out of its cage. It's about having the disciplines able to flex their muscles more fully in the society. It's about not always just critiquing society, but participating in and forming society by our learning.
Well, I'm getting I'm getting goosebumps. I think about this stuff all day long, Bob, and you've just kind of touched on things. We do need to inspire PhDs themselves to think about futures beyond the academy and a variety of futures. We also need to do, as I think you just did, make a really compelling case beyond the academy for the value of the PhD. So how might academics, graduate students, administrators like myself, how do we go and convince, maybe not Lou Simpson, but somebody who isn't as convinced as Lou Simpson? How do we go and be evangelists for this degree in a way that you've just kind of articulated? What are the best routes for this? Because graduate students can often feel disempowered within the academic hierarchy. Do you see this as something that could happen at a national level with an organization like Mellon, ACLS, et cetera? Or do you see this as something that has to happen more, you know, on a case-by-case basis? So an
This is,
anthropologist.
this is a retail question that it's not wholesale. That we talk in the book about the need for PhD career fairs. If we do this for undergraduates, why shouldn't we do it for graduate students? And we're convinced, as I think is ought to be obvious from what we've said, that if employers take a close look at what PhDs have on offer, they're going to hire them. That I talked at one point to somebody who worked in, I think, in PR, and he said he loved to hire PhDs because he said they have this great skill set that somebody else already paid for, and that he could hire them into middle management and then watch them shoot up like comets. That because they had so many skills to begin with. So the question of how do you bring employers into contact with PhDs? Well, you know, deans and administrators can reach out one by one. If you bring prospective employers and prospective employees into contact, in this case, you will certainly form a circuit.
And I would just add to that, I mean, 2 words: to potential employers. And I'm glad you're mentioning this, James, because too often in these discussions, it's all about how do we convince the faculty. Of course, there's other people we need to convince outside the academy, and those are the potential employers. And so my 2 words are hire one. That is to say, hire one PhD, watch what happens, and then there will be no problem in convincing you to hire several next time.
I'd like to. I'm listening to us, and I want to address one issue that is tangential to this. It's true that the academic system, as some of its critics have reasonably labeled it, we're not doing a very good job in our own house of propagating the tenure track jobs that are the main aspiration of most people when they come to graduate school in the first place. We are not neoliberal shills here. Instead, we want to reform the system as much as anybody. We want more tenure track openings, especially in the liberal arts, because as we've suggested, if for no other reason than that society as a whole benefits from it. But we're also concerned about the human beings who are investing their sweat and their treasure into their own educations. We want you to be able to come out of this with a knowledge that you can and will be happy, satisfied, and productive in work that will benefit everybody, not least yourselves.
You know, one of the other questions that I see on the chat has to do with time to degree. And especially if we're suggesting that programs need to provide non-academic internships, or need to ask students to explain their dissertation in lingua franca, or do this, do that, isn't that just going to make a bad situation worse? When I got my PhD, the norm was 4 years for the PhD, and it was a scandal that Berkeley took 5. Now that's just not possible anywhere. Yes, we need to shorten time to degree. It's gotten out of hand. There's not even any sense of what the norm should be. And so it gets longer and longer because there's kind of an arms race in scholarship, which is understandable in a tight job market, but totally regrettable. All right, so if you're going to add some new aspects to the PhD, how do you protect against a bloat in terms of time? And one way you can do that is by listening to one of Harvard's own, Louis Menand, who said in the Marketplace of Ideas that a 3-year PhD would be his ideal. He jokes that it takes 3 years to become a lawyer, 4 to become a doctor, and 8 to teach poetry to college students. And most of us would not agree to a 3-year PhD, but any program will benefit by taking up that challenge. What if you only had 3 years with a PhD student? What of your present program would you retain, and what would you lose or at least reorganize to make it more time efficient? Once you've done that, you can then say, oh, well, we're going to have a 5-year PhD, not a 3-year, so I have 2 years to add things in. Maybe you'll add some things back in, but it gives you room to innovate, try something new.
And as anonymous attendee points out, if that change can be accomplished culturally or across a program, it does free up money that can be used for other valuable funding activities.
Right.
So I just want to keep an eye on time. 12:54, hurtling toward 1 o'clock. Bob, maybe we can give us the top of the hour call sign.
So ask about COVID, James.
Well, let me ask one quick question that has a follow-up, because we were going to talk about this. I kind of lopped it off of the question. Jealousy between colleagues. I think it's an interesting, very particular question. But in the PhD workplace environment, and I suppose this means academia, jealousy can often hinge on a keyword that we didn't really discuss today very much at all, which is prestige, perceived or otherwise, right? Well, I guess it's always perceived. So maybe one or both of you just quickly, negative behaviors in PhD workplace environment. There used to be these horror stories about graduate students hiding books from one another. There's certainly stories that I can tell about the seminar room and nastiness and infighting. The joke about academia is it's so nasty because the stakes are so small. But maybe talk briefly about jealousy in the PhD workplace environment.
Well, we're arguing for a more generous conception of the PhD, one that's more open to the world at large. And I think one of the ways that you cure bad spirit is to open the doors and windows and let in some fresh air. And I think we could do that in academia to our benefit. I also think, though, as we're talking about some of these issues, and by the way, we do treat the sciences, and in the sciences, there are lots of issues of intellectual property. You often find the worst cases of jealousy and usurping in the sciences. But in all of these cases, one thing we want to remind ourselves before the hour is out is that for many of us, doctoral education was an extraordinarily wonderful experience. That is to say, you go through the process of becoming not only a learner, but a discoverer, and a learner better than ever. As the fellow who wrote to me in the email said, this is a very exciting period of life. It's terrific in itself. But as we say in the book, if it becomes a bridge to nowhere, if it becomes anything like a Ponzi scheme, gee, I thought I was going to have the life of the professor I admired as an undergraduate, I'm not going to have that life, and no one told me that. If you have that kind of thing going on, it undermines what is really the rich beauty of a doctoral experience. So I want to remind us that there is joy in the PhD. We need simply to allow people to graduate with a sense of liberty of choice. That when I graduated with a PhD, if someone had said, Bob, you can work for the Wall Street Journal, you can work for the National Park Service, they hire historians and literary people to do tours, you can do this, you can do that, you can do the other thing, or you can have a half-time job at a school at a college in a place where you really don't want to live. My confession is I might have taken that final option because I was just crazy about teaching, and about research, but I would have done it as a matter of choice rather than because it was the only thing I could do in life. Choice is what we're really after here.
So
let's pivot to COVID. Lenny, you mentioned COVID.
Yeah. So come to COVID by a short but slightly roundabout route. That a lot of the things that we've been talking about for the last hour, and which lots of people have also been talking about for the last number of years, we could have started talking about in the 1990s or 1980s. But in the 80s and the 90s, there was absolutely no patience for the kinds of conversations about PhD reform that have gotten traction now. The most important event, I think, looking back at the history, that gave purchase to these imperatives to change the way that we do this PhD education was the 2008 crash. The 2008 financial crash ripped away the fig leaf that a lot of us were using to cover our Netherlands. Just say, oh, it's all going to be okay. Things will get better sometime. We just need to wait. Well, after 2008, that became just increasingly impossible. And a lot of the reform arguments became much more salient, and people started to listen and to do things. And so when we look at COVID, COVID took a situation that was already terrible because we had not recovered in any meaningful way from the 2008 crash in academic hiring. And COVID has made it worse, made it apocalyptically worse. So everything that we have been talking about, we wrote a lot of these words before COVID, but since COVID, they are all the more true. It's time for all of us in administration, faculty, and students to reckon on the reality that's before us and prepare ourselves to not only to work to try to make things better, but also to adapt and adjust and enter that reality in ways that will allow us all to lead productive, fulfilled lives.
Bob, I'll give you the last word.
That's not, if I can just add, this notion of an academic job crisis that comes up from time to time, it started in 1970, and it's been pretty much with ups and downs, but pretty much steady state since then. A 50-year state of being is not a crisis, it's the norm. And we need, after 50 years, finally to say enough is enough, and we need to change our norms.
Well said, Bob. And Lenny, any last words before we sign off?
I think we can leave it there.
Well, thank you both for this. This has been remarkable. Just learning from you both over the last so many years now, actually, not few years, has been a great honor. It was my pleasure to moderate this conversation today. I hope our audience appreciated the talk. And as the kids say, our DMs are open. By that we mean we can be found online, and we have email addresses. Please reach out if we didn't answer your question satisfactorily, or if you want to connect and discuss these issues further. There's plenty of ways you can connect with Bob, Lenny, and myself. I'll answer one last question in the chat for anonymous attendee. And then I'll send us all on our way. Benjamin, are you going to come back and dismiss us, or shall I do that?
Okay, Benjamin, you're muted.
Apologies. Yep, there we go. I'm just going to leave a quick statement reminding everyone to check out the book. I just really want to parrot one of our attendees, Cornelia, and say that this has been an incredibly validating and illuminating conversation. So thank you all so much for speaking on behalf of grad students everywhere. So as I said, I just want to take a moment to thank our wonderful speakers and all of you for spending part of your afternoon with us and showing up for authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and our incredible staff here at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Please make sure to check out the new PhD at the link below. And again, thank you so much for your time. And James, if you had any last minute sort of words for the audience before I sign us off.
No, I would just push people towards Lenny's website, towards Bob's consulting website. Those are both in the bios for the contributors. And I would say buy the book and share it widely. It's needed, necessary. A revitalized PhD can be transformative for our nation. And we need PhDs now more than ever.
Perfect. Great place to end. Thank you again for this talk, and thank you to everyone in the audience for showing up today.
Thanks for coming.
Having us.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Enjoy your day, everyone.